Hello, everybody. I'm not an economist. I apologize. My background is actually history of science and philosophy. And then when I came here, I found myself teaching in a design school, and I became more and more interested in design theory and sustainable design. The last 10 years, I've been very involved in books and articles and conferences, particularly on sustainability and design, and the role of design, if you like, as a potential transformer of behavior, particularly. So this is actually Varanasi, and it's a picture from a front of a book I published in 2016-17 called Somebody Else's Problem, Consumerism, Sustainability and Design. And I'm supposed to be writing a second edition. So it won a prize in America, which really surprised me because the company was going through the hoop at the time, Greenleaf, and they were bought by Routledge. So all the books were locked up in a in a big warehouse, and I wasn't even sure whether I would see it, but but anyway, they seem to want a second edition. So I work in part-time in the Art, Architecture and Design School, and I help run a little relationship with Tianjin University, which is in, if you like, environmental science and technology and design. So. And I've done some work on the circular economy, amongst other things. So there are areas where my interests and your interests probably coincide. So I've called. I should explain. This is really 3 talks in one, because I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview of what I'm interested in. I didn't know who you were actually. Then I recognised Darian, and I've recognised Tom and a few others. So I'm sorry if I'm not very well prepared. The wicked problem is used sometimes when people talk about climate change, a super wicked problem. What they really mean is there's no obvious solutions. It's a problem that has no clear end point and no model to follow, unprecedented. That solutions tend to be better or worse rather than the right or wrong. And the people who are supposed to be charged with solving the problem are actually perpetrating it. So there's this sort of entanglement, if you like, where those who have the authority to actually do something about it are heavily involved in it. Household consumption, there's a recent article by Hertwich and others which basically says that 65% of greenhouse gas emissions can be traced to household consumption. It's very serious because it's growing all the time. And yet consumption is essential to life. Without consumption, without adequate consumption, we die. So consumption is a sort of a fundamental need, not just, and it's not all about luxury. But access, in our system, access can soon become excess, and this makes consumption a particularly difficult problem because those with money will spend more, and I've read articles saying that if you could somehow limit the consumption of Britain to those who are comfortable just above the poverty line, you could reduce Britain's emissions by 10% or more. So you can see that it's in the excess which is often the problem area in consumption. So this little talk is in 3 parts. The first part, just from a very quick historical overview. A lot of you are probably very aware of this. The 1950s, what one environmental historian calls the 1950s syndrome. And what he means is you have every Western country intent on raising living standards through consumption, shifting industry from military equipment, although that's still very much continued, to prioritizing production for consumption. And there's sort of certain pattern involved. And first of all, there was subsidization of education, healthcare, housing, agriculture in Britain particularly, an investment in massive infrastructures, and a shift towards industries that were relatively new at the time. And I'm thinking particularly of chemical agriculture, irrigation, fertilizers, pesticides, and science and technology education. Design, I'm in a design school. It's a very old one, goes back, to the School of Mines and, 100 years. But its real expansion, its real life as a modern school, like most design schools, began in the 50s and 60s. And of course, in Adelaide, it's the 70s as well. And the car was often a keystone product. We have that example in Adelaide of General Motors. And the citizen was seen as equal, more or less, to every other citizen, but this was, in a way, signalled by access through consumption. Consumption, the access that consumption provided. And this famous quote, which is much abused, which you see on the internet under consumerism, excess, etc., by an economist who was writing in the Journal of Retailing in 1955. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek out our spiritual satisfactions, our ego satisfactions in consumption. The measure of social status, of social acceptance, of prestige is now to be found in our consumptive patterns. The very meaning and significance of our lives today are expressed in consumptive terms. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced, and discarded at an ever-increasing pace. And, in a way, this is a model responding to the Depression. It's a model responding to the hardships of the past, and it's also a model responding to the terror of the fear of communism. By making everyone happy, consuming, the theory was that you would in a way spread the wealth throughout society. So far, so good. Now, I'm sorry about this. This was supposed to be 3 different slides. So what we call the growth economy or the linear economy is very much based on this sliding up of standards through a reduction in costs, which really comes from increasing efficiency. So you could say it's a bit like a graph with 2 arms, where costs and prices actually tend to decrease in most products, but the volumes go up because, as you're probably aware, when if you look at Walmart or any big producer, they might be able to produce something much cheaper than somebody else. And, as the prices go down, their margins go down. Therefore, they need to flood the market. And this is the problem with growth. And the difficulty is that efficiency is not enough. This is one of my points I try and make in my book. If you look at the airline industry, for example, 1% increase per year in eco-efficiencies, but you've got 4 to 5% more people flying, yeah? So, this is sort of the so-called Jevons, it's Jevons paradox. Technically is a bit more than that, but another interesting example is if you look at, say, imports into the US over a 10-year period in the 90s and early 2000s, you find that they weigh everything, right? It's very useful. So, the unit weights tended to be lower over that 10-year period. They went down in most categories of goods. The unit price went down in most categories of goods, sometimes by a lot, but generally, they went down. But the volumes went up. See, this is the kind of relationship I'm trying to emphasize. So, the paradox, the result of this paradox, which is a bit more than the Jevons paradox, which is a rebound effect, which is the effect that, you generate more consumption, when you when you become more efficient, you tend to generate more consumption. But for example, LED lighting. You introduce LED lighting, everyone can afford more lighting. They're getting free lighting effectively. So you end up flooding your home, with LED lighting because you've got this massive discount for your lighting. Yeah. So backfire is when the result of this rebound effect is so great that you're actually undoing the benefits of your eco-efficiency. Yeah. So anyway, the overall global result of this paradox that I'm trying to draw attention to. Sorry about can you hear me all right? Yeah. Is that we're making greener things. We're making greener things in almost every category. Cars are greener than they were 20 years ago. Yeah, they're all more efficient, eco-efficient, but our emissions are growing. Yeah, and this is why it's a wicked problem. This is the sort of this is why there's no obvious solution. From a consumer's point of view, consumption looks very different. It's all about routines, what the sociologists call practices, and it tends to be grouped around products, key products like the motor car, which are the face of a system. And the system is unfortunately what is measured and talked about by scientists. Environmental science, they talk about transportation. They don't talk about your car, my car. Yeah? And so what the consumer sees is home, health, car, phone, products, clothes, food, etc. So, but behind those are systems. And what we've done in the past up to now is we've tended to measure, in environmental science, the outputs from these systems. But if we're going to change behaviour, we have to start talking to the consumer. And this is a problem because individually, consumers now know less about what's in their pocket, what's in their hand, than ever before, ever. No other generation has been so ignorant about, what we actually consume. I have no idea where the bits inside my iPhone come from, and I work with industrial designers. They can tell me quite a few of the origins, but Apple itself probably doesn't know that there were slaves in the supply chain somewhere. Yeah. So this becomes a really interesting issue. So I'll speed this up a little bit. So we make more stuff for more people more rapidly, and this leads to a faster cycle of production, use, and discard. And unfortunately, lower margins, this is the flip side of the Jevons paradox, lower margins drives up volumes. Because if, say, a widget like a wine glass 20 years ago cost $10 and now it costs $1, you've got to produce 20 times more and probably diversify to stay in business. Yeah? So this is the world of design. Designers are the ones trying to make the glass sexy to sell more, So this is where I come in, into your world of economics. Yeah. So what happens is, because you end up with so much stuff, you've got to get rid of it faster and upgrade. And it becomes easier to upgrade because it's cheaper, and you've reduced all the barriers to consumption that existed in the past. You're in the past, you had to go to the shop. You had to find the money or a check. You had to have money in your account. Now there's none of these barriers exist. It's all frictionless flow, money and goods. So you need to make more waste. You need to conceal, as a company, you need to conceal where you're getting it from. Often because you don't know yourself, because you've got so many middlemen. And this is, if you like, the lack of transparency that, I'll be talking about in a minute. And there's also a greater urgency. Because you've got more money, you need to spend more, you need to know more, you need to understand more. And so you get this phenomenon that philosophers and some economics call social acceleration, which is linked to technological acceleration. Yeah? People even walk faster now in cities than they did 20 years ago. It's hard to believe, isn't it? So, this creates economic distortions as producers and consumers seek out the best value, you know, and they might buy something not knowing that they're made by slaves, you know. So, making waste. Waste is what we leave behind. This is what the anthropologists say, you know. Waste is the greater mobility we have, the more waste we create. This leads to more faster consumption, leads to more disposal and sooner. So you have packaging, coffee cups, you know, those people wandering around with coffee cups, you know. We did a study on those and we don't know how many there are in the world. You know, the people talk about 500 billion a year, right? And that comes from an interview with a guy from Starbucks in 2010, but it goes around and everyone thinks it's accurate. We have no idea. The scale of it is just so vast. You know, it's sort of mind-boggling, you know? And forests and lakes are being cut down so people can get 10 minutes ahead on their way to work with their coffee. You know? It's really insane, you know, some of this. You know, what's happening is product lifespans are going down. So one of my speakers in the recent conference, Timothy Cooper, that's his specialty, you know, studying reduced lifespans and why people are doing this, you know. We have more problem wastes. We've become very clever at making laminated materials, plastics and papers, aluminiums and papers. These can't be easily disposed of because we're not thinking about the waste, we're thinking about the product in use and the sale. Because the money comes from the sale, not what happens afterwards. And, you know, what it means is that a lot of things are not worth recycling. You know, and this is an economic problem, you know, in the waste industry. So technology, in a way, has made us, you know, a kind of a frictionless flow of goods to consumers. But it has this dramatic impact on soil, particularly in the developing world, where maybe 50% of waste is actually collected. This is a wonderful photograph by one of my students of what happens when poor people have no waste collection. They sort of find a corner, a place, you know. And in Jakarta, it tends to be in the river, or it tends to end up in the river. So the other problem I wanted to draw attention to is transparency and traceability. And in February, you're all welcome to come along to a seminar we're organising on transparency, because Robert Costanza is our keynote, and there's a few other really good people. You know, he's an economist. So transparency makes us vulnerable. You know, when we expose what we're doing, we feel, you know, oh, am I okay? It's like me without a shirt. You know, I don't look too handsome underneath. Transparency has this effect on companies. You know, they become vulnerable. So they give us marketing, you know, branding. You know, we're really good. We were founded in a garage, and we're really honest, and we're very skillful, etc. And so design disguises what's in the box as well. So the result of all this is consumers don't know what they're consuming most of the time. And you have to get right away from blaming them, because it's a deliberate thing. It's not as though, you know, I mean, you expect the average Joe to get a PhD in understanding what they're consuming, you know? It's really difficult, really difficult. Many producers don't know what they're producing because of complex, lengthy supply chains. There was a recent report by the Baptist Research Organization on textiles, and they found some of the largest makers of clothes didn't know where their cotton was coming from. So, you know, it's not as though you can say, you know, that it's somebody's fault. It's somebody else's problem, but it's nobody's fault. So, So this is by somebody I was showing. I had an exhibition of photographs a couple of years ago, and this was by Oxford. Well, he's now at Exeter. Matthew Cole. He's a marine biologist who was one of the first people to discover the extent of microplastic pollution. So, consumer restlessness. Everyone's more mobile. Everyone's walking faster, working faster. And there's less barriers to consumption. It's cheaper. It's easier. It's in our pocket. And so you end up with this faster cycle, and it forces people to constantly try and catch up. And the ease of upgrading tends to destabilize our relationship with things. We expect things to break, to be replaced faster and sooner. And this expectation is very, very serious. Like a mobile phone. There's an interesting example where a company started giving new mobile phones to people whenever they signed up. And there was no kind of length of time attached. So what this resulted in was they had a huge growth in numbers of people, who are signing up, but you effectively doubled the number of mobile phones that they were distributing. Yeah? So this becomes waste, very sooner as well. Cars, appliances, kitchens, textiles, phones, buildings, they're all aging faster. And this is a big problem as well. Now, market distortions, you probably know all about this, but you think of the $10 t-shirt. It does not necessarily reflect the price of the resources, the labour, and it encourages overconsumption because the consumer is encouraged to buy 3 instead of 1. So this is, this leads to overspending and to consumerism, where you're focused all the time, you're thinking all the time about acts of consumption and the benefits that might bring to you. So anyway, I'll probably have to skip through this. So the third part, what I wanted to do is, how do we get to the goal of the development goal, which, by the way, we've all signed up to. You're probably aware of this. Number 12, enabling sustainable consumption and production. So to start off, what is unsustainable consumption? Well, I've tried to run through some of it, that using up available resources, avoiding responsibility for pollution, for degradation, concealing the impacts of production, extraction to consumers, to investors, to governments, distorting markets where social environmental impacts are treated as external, they're somebody else's problem. These sort of, when you try and define what unsustainable consumption is, you more or less come up with the targets of this particular sustainable development goal, with a few additional things which, like resource use, etc., which I won't talk about because I want to focus on the consumption side. But if you look at the various targets, there's 4 themes that really jump out at you. One is transparency, one is waste reduction, one is economic reform, and one is sustainable lifestyles. And they're all linked together. You can't really deal with one without dealing with the others. So transparency. A report on the effectiveness of the war on waste really changed my mind about consumers' responses to transparency. I was involved in this CRC on low carbon living, and they did this sort of investigation on what people experienced from the war on waste. You've probably all seen it, on TV. They found around over 60% were affected by it and made changes to their behaviour because of it. Now, if I was a social psychologist and I was trying to change people's behaviour, if I get anywhere close to 60, I would be in heaven. I'd think, wow, I'm really effective. So, this really convinced me that we've got to look much more closely at transparency. Now, the transparency, particularly because we have the technology in our pockets to use live labelling, to use QR codes, to do a lot of things that would enable us to know where the products we have come from. and what those environmental impacts are, what those social impacts are. So, and there's more and more of groups like Provenance, which is a UK-based group that is creating a platform, uses blockchain to try and help companies be assured that what they're selling, they actually understand. You know? That, because one of the interesting things about this little conference in February is that we've got case studies from people, and one of the people giving a case study is talking about small SMEs and how difficult it is for them to understand what they're selling, because they're commissioning people in China to make them, and they lose control of their own, you know, what is actually happening to the products that they're designing and they're trying to sell. So apps are very interesting in this regard. You now have the capacity to have live labeling, where you have maybe scores for things, you know, environmental, social, etc., and you can actually allow people to see how good or bad they are. And the problem at the moment is we have 60 different labels, and you know, most of them don't work, or not very well. So you know, this is something I think needs to be revisited, particularly if you have some government regulation which pushes this forward as a worthwhile policy. So that's the first point I want to make. The second one is waste reduction. Circular economy initiatives are very interesting, because circular economy is actually a revolutionary idea. And it's an old idea, and that is that everything is reused. And when you reuse it, you try to retain its value or increase its value as you reuse it. So technically, you take something and you try not just to downcycle it, say turning waste textile into insulation, something like that, but you try and retain its value or increase its value, you know, as it goes through. But this means actually looking at production, looking at what people do at the beginning, because most of what we have are things made to waste. Look at that laptop. If I took it apart, most of it would be glued together. You wouldn't be able to recycle it effectively. You wouldn't be able to take anything from it and actually use it again. So in effect, its value goes down. And even buildings are the same. I have a friend who I interviewed actually on a webinar thing. He takes buildings apart and then puts them back together again as new. You know, and he's now dealing with a big bank that treats their new building as a resource bank. You know, instead of just saying this building's going to be worthless in 20 years, these guys are saying, no, it's worth, this component is worth this component is worth this, and it could actually appreciate if we remake it, you know, in some way. So it's potentially a revolutionary idea, and there are small niche developments like Fairphone where they're actually trying to follow this kind of thinking, reuse, yeah. So in a way, you know, we come back to the old idea of precaution. You know, first, do no harm. It's very revolutionary. So, economic incentives. My favourite out of all these is probably Walter Stahl. Dear old Walter, he's a lovely man, and his idea was you shift the tax burden in society from income to impact. So, you know, so instead of the Conservatives jumping up and down saying this is going to be terrible, you know, we're paying more tax, you say, well, actually, all we're going to do is start taxing those that are making the mess, you know. And so it's actually part of quite a complicated idea about retaining value in things, but he is probably the founder, in my view, of the circular economy concept. So making sustainability the norm should be the goal. It shouldn't be a costly, experimental strategy for the individual to follow, because that's what it is at the moment. Buying a Tesla, who can afford one, you know? It's become, you know, and this is part of this business of individualizing this problem, when actually it's a systemic problem. It's not an individual problem. So the other technique would be to eliminate the advantages of waste making. Let's take your average cafe as an example. The average cafe has copied Starbucks and worked out that they can sell 70% of their coffee to people walking past in takeaway containers. Their whole business model is based on somebody making waste somewhere else, away from, away from the cafe. They don't have to have all these tables. They can have maybe 10 tables and they can sell hundreds of coffees an hour, And this model is great for business, but really bad for the environment, if you allow it to happen. So, so the other technique that we talk a lot about in design is localization of production using technology, 3D printing, etc. So there are many economic levers that could be used, and I think a lot of you have probably spent far more time than I have thinking about this, but it's certainly a very interesting issue. Now, this is perhaps one of the more interesting ones, which links back to what I was saying at the beginning, sustainable lifestyles. At the moment, design, particularly marketing, advertising, are all there to encourage more consumption because our economy depends upon more throughput, faster throughput, making more stuff for more people faster, preferably cheaper to get more people involved. And somehow we've got to switch the historical clock back to before all this started and start thinking about what consumption was like when you just had one thing and it was good and you enjoyed it and you kept it and you kept it for a long time. You didn't throw it out, when it wore out prematurely. When my dad died, I remember in his cupboard, this is going back nearly 20 years, he had these brogues, which were copies of, made in India, which were copies of brogues he had in 1920s. So, these shoes were still wearable. They were all leather. Now, you're really lucky to get 2 or 3 years out of a pair of shoes. So, you've got this sort of declining quality in everything, which is, the whole basis of it, the whole idea is to encourage consumption, throughput, because margins are too small, with this, and you have to get paid straight away, So this really requires reconsidering the values embedded in consumption. At the moment, most consumption is triggered by extrinsic values. Am I okay? Do I look all right? Those extrinsic values are how other people see us, It's the intrinsic values, though, that we remember and that count, like family, community, place, nature. And, in a way, consumption diverts us away from these. I've seen experiments where students, will go into a room and be asked, about something really innocent like carpooling. Do you want to carpool? And one room will be told, if you carpool, it's going to save the world as you reduce, emissions. Another room, they'll be told, it'll save you money. Extrinsic, intrinsic, yeah? So the ones who are going to save the world, they recycle their paper from the scribbling little exercise you give them. The others don't. Very few of them do. And so you can see, you can trigger values, and advertising and design triggers different kinds of values, universal values. So, so in a way, this is the world of the ideal. This is where we want to end up. But the issue is, how do we get there? That's, for me, something for economics, for sociology, for anthropology, and for design especially. Because design is a bit like bringing something magic out of a hat. Think of a plastic chair. I remember when the first plastic chair was designed in Italy, everyone thought, wow, it's so efficient. You just pour plastic into a mold and here it is, and you can see it looks sexy, it's amazing, in red. And then 10 years later, they're floating in the Pacific. There's so many. And so design can suddenly produce something that becomes desirable for everybody. And the consequences can be disastrous, environmentally. Yeah. So anyway, I probably have said enough. So what I'd like you to do is just to sort of emphasize that this is a pathway, an iterative pathway, and it requires really greater transparency, waste reduction, elimination, economic incentivization, and a shift to a more custodial, frugal culture of consumption and use. And design and advertising need to come behind this. But that means different business models. It means a revolution, effectively, in culture, you know. And I just feel we've avoided this for too long. So anyway, thank you. Oh, this is the seminar. If you're interested, please come along. I think you'd enjoy it. Yeah. Thank you. And the speakers are next one. Thanks so much.